Let's get right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking the massive, multi-layered aftermath of the recent U.S. Iran war, officially known as Operation Epic Fury. We're pulling directly from grounded source material to figure out exactly where things stand right now. We'll be digging into the immense financial costs, some really surprising details hidden in the ceasefire agreement, and a legal ghost from the 1980s that is suddenly incredibly relevant again. To make sense of this whole geopolitical web, we've broken it down into 5 key sections: the $200 billion question, inside the preliminary deal, the nuclear program, a 1981 legal loophole, and finally, reparations and enforcement. All right, Section 1, the $200 billion question. Let's talk about the immediate sticker shock of this conflict. So, literally just days after ceasefire talks were publicly confirmed, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and the Trump administration officially requested a gargantuan $200 billion supplemental budget. And this money? It's earmarked specifically for the war in Iran. When they were asked if the emerging peace talks meant this cash was no longer needed, the administration signaled they'd push for it anyway, pointing to a dangerous international security situation. But honestly, this just brilliantly highlights a much larger ask, because that $200 billion is really just one piece of an astounding $1.5 trillion budget request for the broader U.S. military. It absolutely puts the sheer scale of proposed defense spending into perspective. Now, you might be wondering, where does a number that large actually go? Well, these funds are aimed at rapidly rebuilding the Pentagon's depleted munitions stockpile after 39 days of strikes. It also heavily funds next-generation weapons, plus the highly publicized Golden Dome anti-missile system. And keep in mind, this massive ask stacks directly on top of the $150 billion in extra defense money already approved last year in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This is a perfect example of how conflicts rapidly accelerate domestic defense spending, locking in huge financial commitments long after the actual fighting stops. Moving on to Section 2, inside the preliminary deal. Let's open up the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding. When you boil down that complex 14-point agreement, 4 massive shifts jump right out at you. First, the U.S. Treasury is set to immediately issue waivers for Iranian oil exports, while both nations map out procedures to release frozen assets. There's also a staggering $300 billion reconstruction plan on the table. And critically, there's an agreement for on-site uranium downblending supervised by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, here's where things get really fascinating. If you impartially compare the public rhetoric leading up to this deal with the actual written text, there's quite a gap. We have a public statement from the president on June 5th explicitly stating there would be no unfreezing assets or lifting sanctions up front. But if you look at the June 17th agreement text, it explicitly states the U.S. Treasury will immediately issue waivers for crude oil exports and make frozen funds fully available. Energy analysts actually estimate that returning to pre-war production levels with these immediate waivers could allow Iran to make up to $60 billion a year. It's a stark reminder that in high-stakes diplomacy, the final written text often looks very different from public negotiation tactics. And then there's this jaw-dropping number, a $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran. During a press conference, the president publicly called reports of this fund false. However, the fund is in fact explicitly written into the Memorandum of Understanding. Now, the crucial nuance here, based on reporting, is that this $300 billion is supposedly comprised entirely of private sector commitments from around the world, rather than U.S. taxpayer dollars. Still, the U.S. government is committing to granting the required licenses and waivers to make those financial transactions possible. All right, Section 3, the nuclear program. Let's look at the unresolved tensions right at the heart of this conflict. By comparing the text of the 2015 Obama-era JCPOA, which, remember, the Trump administration withdrew from and heavily criticized, with this new 2026 Trump MOU, you can see the core pledges regarding nuclear weapons are remarkably similar. Both frameworks fundamentally rely on Iran formally reaffirming that it will not seek, procure, or develop nuclear weapons. But, as always, the devil is in the details. The new agreement states that Iran's highly enriched material, which is currently sitting at around 60%, just shy of weapons grade, will be down-blended on-site under IAEA supervision. However, arms control experts point out a major gap here. It currently lacks the specific, detailed verification requirements we've seen in previous agreements. Essentially, it kicks the hardest, most complex enrichment and verification issues down the road into a 60-day negotiation period. It's basically a placeholder for a much more difficult conversation that hasn't happened yet. Section 4, a 1981 legal loophole. This is how a ghost from the past triggered a modern-day lawsuit. You really have to ask yourself, How on earth could an agreement signed 45 years ago regarding a totally different historical event, the Tehran hostage crisis, actually penalize the United States for military strikes today? To connect those dots, we have to rewind all the way to 1981. The Algiers Accords were signed to end the 1979 hostage crisis, and a key part of those accords was the creation of the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal. Amazingly, that tribunal is still sitting in The Hague today. And while most claims had strict deadlines back in 1982, certain clauses regarding the interpretation of the accords specifically left the door open for arbitration without any expiration date whatsoever. Which brings us to point 1 of the 1981 General Declaration. It explicitly laid out an indefinite commitment stating, "It is and from now on will be the policy of the United States not to intervene, directly or indirectly, politically or militarily, in Iran's internal affairs." Because of the phrasing, "from now on," legal scholars argue this wasn't just a promise for the 1980s. It established a forward-looking, legally binding obligation. So let's take that 1981 non-intervention clause and stack it up against the realities of Operation Epic Fury. Launched in February 2026, the operation struck over 13,000 targets in just 39 days. It resulted in the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We have reports of civilian infrastructure, like hospitals and fuel depots, taking hits. Plus, U.S. leaders publicly urged the Iranian population to take over your government. International law experts argue that, regardless of any self-defense justification, executing regime change rhetoric and assassinating a head of state easily constitutes coercive intervention in a nation's internal affairs, which directly violates that 1981 treaty. Finally, Section 5, Reparations and Enforcement. Let's look at the immense hurdles standing in the way of this lawsuit. Because, guys, this isn't just some hypothetical law school debate. Recent reporting confirms Iran has actually pulled the trigger on this route. They've formally responded to U.S. proposals via diplomatic intermediaries by outright demanding war reparations for the damage caused during Epic Fury. So how would that even work? In theory, the international legal path is pretty straightforward. Step 1, Iran submits the dispute to the Claims Tribunal. Step 2, the tribunal evaluates the breach of that 1981 non-intervention clause. Step 3, the tribunal theoretically has the authority to award massive financial damages to Iran. But step 4, that is the ultimate bottleneck. Enforcing any multi-billion-dollar payout would require third-party nations, like a bank over in Europe, for example, to freeze U.S. assets. Doing so would place those foreign courts in a diplomatically explosive position, risking immense strain with the United States. So we leave you with this final thought to take away from this explainer. As major world powers clash and treaties from decades ago are breached, does international law truly hold anyone accountable? Or, when all is said and done, is the enforcement of these so-called binding agreements just a matter of sheer political convenience? Thank you so much for joining us as we unpacked the source material behind this incredibly complex issue. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.